jump in there and I will try to do this.
Bill, thanks for that kind introduction. You must have called my mom to get the high points of my career. Some of them were actually true, so I'm grateful. I also appreciated the Irish blessing, although in my Irish household, we always had an additional line that somehow got lost here, something about may the devil not hear about your demise until 10 days or a week after the funeral. So I think that's a very important part of the blessing. Thanks very much. If it looks like I'm glowing, it's only partially because I'm here speaking to the Rotary. Last week, I took a group of students and faculty out to the Department of Energy nuclear labs at Los Alamos and Sandia. And I felt like Homer Simpson going through one of the containment vessels of one of the research reactors. But I checked my back pocket and no isotopes came home with me. But Rotary has a very special place in my heart. Way back when I was in graduate school, I was slated to do a summer hitch in the intelligence community, and I had some time between the end of classes and when my clearance had come through. So I was home in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and I needed some money. So my dad said, why don't you call Pat Buckley, a guy who owned a tree service, but he was also, like many of you, quite active in Rotary. And so I called Pat up and I said, hey, are you hiring people for the tree service? He said, well, I understand you're in graduate school and you're studying US foreign policy in Latin America. Why don't you come to Rotary next week and tell us about it? Made no commitment about the job at that point. So I came out and I talked about the Central American crisis. Weird job interview for being a rake jockey and hauling a chainsaw around, but I guess it worked out. Hopefully I don't need a job after this session today, but I do have copies of my resume, so it's not that far a commute from Granger out here. So what I want to talk about today is two related things. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the current Ukraine crisis. And then secondly, I want to prognosticate a little bit about how it might end. And I want to be uncharacteristically humble because I got to say, I, for one, was quite surprised that we've gotten as far down the road of the crisis in Ukraine as we have. So anyhow, so keep that in mind when I give you my sense of how we can get out of the crisis. But before doing that, I want to talk a little bit about the historical roots of the crisis. And how many of you people remember the radio commentator Paul Harvey? There we go. See, this is my demographic. I tell my kids Paul Harvey, or I tell my students, they look at me like I'm from Mars. But I want to give you the rest of the story in the sense that there are elements of the Ukraine crisis that I don't think that we talk about or think about as much as we should. Now, my bottom line is I'm still optimistic that we can get out of this crisis without it going to World War III. But on the other hand, I don't want to minimize for a minute the human cost of what's happened over there, you know, over the course of the last 2 weeks and what's likely to happen before we get this solved. So let me talk about two elements of the historical context that we should keep in mind. The first is the complicated history of Ukrainian nationalism and the Ukrainian state, and particularly the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. Second bit of history I want to talk about is a little bit more recent, and that's the role of NATO expansion in this current crisis. So let me run through those things relatively quickly. I don't think that the argument that Ukraine is not somehow a legitimate state, that it's a fake state, that it's not a real state, is tenable. But on the other hand, there is a lot of truth in the notion that the history of Ukraine as an independent political entity is complex. And let me see if there we go. If I can operate the PowerPoint here. The origins of Ukraine, and indeed of Russia as a modern state, go back to the 10th century. And a political organization called the Kievan Rus, which was not only an important political center in terms of unifying the disparate peoples west of the Urals, but it was also the body that brought Orthodox Christianity to this area of the world. And so Russian Orthodoxy and Ukrainian Orthodoxy, in fact, have similar sorts of roots. And in fact, Ukraine, for much of the history since the Kievan Rus, has been part of the Russian Empire. So it's been affiliated in some way, sometimes subsumed, sometimes a vassal state to Russia for much of its history. It's a lot like modern Poland, which we forget for about 500 years was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Russian Empire and only became an independent state after the First World War. Now, the more recent history, by recent I mean past 150 years, that really matters is the status of Ukraine within the Soviet Union. Now, remember the Soviet Union was in all the papers until about 1993. It wasn't actually one country. It was, at least on paper, 13 political entities that in the communist sort of delusion were one big happy family. Actually, it was more like a bag of weasels, you know, with a lot of quite, unruly and sometimes ungovernable peoples all together. Now, the early Bolsheviks, Lenin and Stalin, understood at the founding period of the Soviet Union, at the end of the Civil War, 1920 and 1921, that on the one hand, they wanted to build one big political entity that they called the Soviet Union. But they also understood that a lot of the peoples that they wanted to be part of the Soviet Union also had at least some element of national consciousness. So they thought to themselves, how are we going to deal with this? Well, they dealt with it in two ways. One is they divided the Soviet Union into smaller republics, including a republic called the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. But also, if you look in, I've got to actually, if you look in Central Asian, you'll see the Kazakh People's Republic, the Turkmenistan People's Republic, you know, yada, yada, yada. And so on the one hand, they paid lip service, a tip of the Ushanka, you know, the Russian furry hat, to national identity. On the other hand, they were under no illusions that this was going to be a facade. And it was a facade for two reasons. One is the borders of these ethnic republics were drawn not reflecting the real ethnic or linguistic reality. And two, they stuffed a lot of ethnic Russians in these states, including the Ukraine. And that was, as the communists used to say, no accident, comrade. That was part of the strategy for maintaining the Soviet Union under the dominance of the Russian SSR. Okay, now the communists never thought that the Soviet Union was going to fall apart, so they didn't foresee the problems that these gerrymandered borders and presence of large numbers of Russians in ethnic republics would cause. But in fact, when the Soviet Union fell apart finally in 1993, there were a lot of Ruskies in the newly independent states. The biggest conglomeration of them, by the way, were in the Ukraine, but there are plenty in the Baltic states, for example. Estonia has probably about 25% of the population, either ethnic Russian or Russian speaking. And so that was a problem. The other thing that happened that's relevant to our talk today is Nikita Khrushchev. Remember him? He was the Soviet leader who followed Joseph Stalin. He was also Ukrainian by ethnicity. He decided for some reason to give Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, which is a big factor in the current conflict with Ukraine, to the Ukrainian SSR. Okay, and again, Khrushchev, figured this is just an administrative thing. This will have no real implications. Of course, in effect, what had happened, what the communists did was plant 2 time bombs that were destined to explode with the breakup of the Soviet Union. It's really interesting. If you read the essay that either President Putin wrote or had ghost written on the unity of the Ukrainian and Russian peoples last July, he spends most of his time putting the wood to the Bolsheviks for having created this Rube Goldberg machine of a country, which was destined to create trouble. Okay, so that's one big historical thing that we need to keep in mind. Second thing that we need to keep in mind in terms of as a root of the current crisis is what I call the original sin of NATO expansion. Now, at the end of the Cold War, between 1989 and 1991, the big issue between the United States, Britain, and France on one hand, and the Soviet Union, led by Mikhail Gorbachev on the other, was the future of Germany. Germany, you may recall, as a result of the post-World War, the German Federal Republic, and then the German People's Democratic Republic. And the question was, with the end of the Cold War and the imminent breakup of the Warsaw Pact, what was going to happen to East Germany? And Gorbachev and Jim Baker, former President H.W. Bush, 41's Secretary of State, sat down to negotiate this tricky wicket. Now, you're looking at me, you're saying, Germany, where does Germany fit in all this? We're talking about Russia versus NATO, or Russia versus the United States. But Germany fits in this, particularly in the Russian historical consciousness, but also the historical consciousness of most of the rest of Europe, because Germany was the cause, arguably, of 2 major world wars. And in fact, When NATO was formed after World War II in 1949, the first Secretary General of NATO, a British guy by the name of Lord Ismay, in a probably after dinner and a few drinks and in a candid moment admitted that NATO had not one but three purposes. The obvious purpose, of course, was to defend Western Europe against the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies. But it had two other purposes that were equally, if not more important. Second was to bind the United States to European security. So keep the Russians out, keep the Americans in, and the third thing was to keep the Germans down. Now you might think, geez, three Reichs and you're out. How could Germany be a threat today? That usually kills at the Council on Foreign Relations. But it was and remains a big deal. And so the deal that Baker and Gorbachev cut, and it was only a verbal deal, was that Germany could be reunited. And East Germany could be a part of NATO if NATO agreed not to go 1 inch beyond the East German border. And Gorbachev, wasn't a fan of NATO expansion, but the Soviets, this is sort of a dirty secret, but I'm going to let you in on it. The Soviets had always been more comfortable with Germany in NATO. The United States was sort of regarded as Germany's chaperone. And so if Germany was going to be reunified with the East, you might as well include them there. Now, problem is almost immediately after this period of time, the former Warsaw Pact countries in Eastern Europe, and then once they became independent states, the Baltic states, and some of the other former Soviet republics started clamoring to get into NATO. And you can't blame them. I mean, living next to the bear, which they had done for centuries, was not uncomfortable. And so joining, NATO seemed like a way to ensure their security. And in fact, beginning in the Clinton administration, the United States started moving inexorably in the direction of reneging on Jim Baker's promise. Why was that the case? Part of it is, I think we just couldn't believe that the Russians were really serious in regarding NATO expansion as a threat. After all, NATO was a defensive alliance, and it was made up of democracies, and democracies are good guys. We tell ourselves that every chance we have to say it, okay? So we were predisposed to dismiss Russian concerns on those grounds. Electoral politics within the United States was also a big deal. Second largest Polish city in the world is not Elkhart, Chicago, right? But they don't celebrate Dingus Day there, so I'm not sure what's going on, but nonetheless. And finally, there was a small faction within the national security community that never believed that Russia would democratize, and that eventually it would be a threat. And so they saw NATO expansion as a hedge. Now, I spent a lot of time in Russia in the 1990s. It was like being in Dodge City in the Wild West. It was privatizing at a, just an incredible rate. Politically, it was opening up in a way that it never had, although in a very chaotic fashion. It was just an incredible place to be. And I knew a lot of, or had the chance to meet a lot of Russian Democrats. And in fact, I was in a very small meeting with Yeltsin's foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, who, by the way, now lives in Florida. And I was with a very influential Harvard professor, Sam Huntington, who the Russians knew was close to Tony Lake, who was Clinton's national security advisor. And Kozyrev invited Sam for this meeting to try to get across the message that if we in the West were interested in the future of Russian democracy, the last thing we would do would be to expand NATO. This was in 1995. And in fact, we didn't listen to Kozyrev. In 1999, April of 1999, the first post-Cold War wave of NATO expansion occurs. Poland, Slovenia, and the Czech Republic are brought into NATO, April 1999. Later in that year, December of 1999, a hitherto obscure St. Petersburg political operative by the name of Vladimir Putin was appointed interim president by Boris Yeltsin and would go on to win the election as president in 2000. So cause and effect sure looks like it to me. Initially, Putin continued Yeltsin's efforts to improve relations with the West, but on the issue of NATO expansion, he was a lot more publicly resistant. But of course, we didn't listen. We had another wave of NATO expansion in 2004. But the key thing was the NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania in 2008, in which NATO, at the prodding of the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, opened up the door for eventual NATO membership for Georgia and for Ukraine. Okay, 2008, Russia and Georgia go to war. Again, a link between the open door for NATO and that conflict seems very clear. Now, for most Americans, the Russia-US conflict over Ukraine begins in 2016 with the Russian seizure of Crimea. Actually, in 2013 and 14, a series of protests, the Maidan Square protests, erupt against a Russian-leaning Ukrainian president by the name of Viktor Yanukovych. And Yanukovych is ousted and forced to leave the country. And the key political issue that Yanukovych had run afoul of is that the European Union was proposing an enhanced status for Ukraine in the EU. And many pro-Western Ukrainians were thrilled with this, but the Russians and the Russian speakers regarded it as sort of a stalking horse for eventual NATO membership. And so in 2016, Russia seizes the Crimea, and then also a separatist movement in the Donbass region or the eastern region of Russia takes off, and Russia is clearly implicated in supporting that. Now, 2 slides here on the political and linguistic geography of Ukraine. Politically, we sort of measure the sense of pro or anti-Russian sentiment by the results of the 2012 election. And anybody who voted for Yanukovych, who was, overtly pro-Russian, we regard as being pro-Russian, and people who voted for Yulia Tymoshenko were probably anti-Russian. And what you could see with the dark red and the light red is that the majority Russian-leaning part of the country is in the east, in fact, in the area where the Donbass is. And in fact, Crimea was the most pro-Russian of any part of Ukraine. The percentage of people in Crimea who voted for Yanukovych was around 85%. And so after the annexation in 2016, and when the handful of pro-Ukrainian people got out of Dodge, the referendum that said that over 90% of the people in Crimea were happy to be part of Russia probably was a legitimate reflection of political opinion there. But we can also look at the divisions of Ukraine linguistically. So places where Russia is the mother tongue or the primary tongue, you assume not everybody, but the vast majority of people are probably more pro-Russian and interested in a closer alignment between Ukraine and Moscow. Whereas those gold areas of the country are places in which Ukrainian, which is a Slavic language and it's close to Russian, but distinct, is the predominant language. So the context for the invasion in February of this year was a period of about 8 years of increasing Western support for the anti-Russian, not anti-Russian, but what's the way to say it? The more independence-minded Ukrainian government in Kiev that not only supported and encouraged their nationalist aspirations, but also engaged in a rebuilding and retraining of the Ukrainian army. And we're seeing the results of it today. The Ukrainian army of 2022 is fighting far more effectively than the Ukrainian army of 2016, which basically lost Luhansk and Donetsk to a bunch of street gangs. So I have gone on way too long. This was a danger. You invite a college professor, he can't clear his throat in 25 minutes, much less go through 1,000 years of history. But I'm just going to put the 4 scenarios out on the table and tell you which one I think is likely. I don't think we're in danger of World War III. I think, and you've seen it already, the United States has no interest in getting into major military fight with another nuclear power. So President Zelensky is deeply frustrated with us for not agreeing to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And the Poles are unhappy with us because we won't help them in this Ponzi scheme they have for transferring old Warsaw Pact jets to us in trade for some spiffy new American jets that we then send to Ukraine. And this is a function of there are red lines that we're not going to cross. Now, we will provide certain level of military aid to Ukraine, although the Russian attack on this training base near the Polish border is clarifying that red line. Nonetheless, I don't think World War III is in the cards. And ironically, the great power that's going to pull our chestnuts out of the fire may be the People's Republic of China. And talk a little bit about that. I also don't think a Ukrainian victory, military victory, is at all likely. President Zelensky has been heroic in his leadership. The Ukrainian military has fought very well and exacted more than a pound of flesh from the Russian army. But they are eventually going to be mowed over. There's no way to get around that. There are two more likely scenarios. One is a limited Russian military victory in the east of Ukraine, in the area east of the Dniester River. I think that there's some possibility that they could achieve that. I'm not sure if the Russians ever thought about getting control of all of Ukraine, but I'm convinced in the fiber of my being that they just couldn't do it if they wanted to. But the final option, and one that ironically, given how bad things look now, I actually think there's a lot of evidence might come through, is a negotiated settlement. So there's a split screen that we're seeing on our TVs. We're seeing horrendous pictures of the human suffering of the Ukrainian people as a result, particularly of the spread of the war into urban areas. But on the other hand, the Ukrainian delegation and the Russian delegation are met this morning and continuing to meet. And the Chinese now are starting to make noise about brokering some sort of agreement. So I got a lot more I could say about that, but I got a lot more I could say about just about everything. I want to be mindful of your time, but that's my story. Not sure if I'm sticking to it beyond this talk. See me tomorrow and see what I say. But thank you very much for your kind attention.
I think in light of the time, and I know some folks could stay, but others have got to leave. I'm sure that Michael will hang out for a few minutes up here. Welcome to come up and ask a question. And I just want to thank you so much. And absolutely, we knew that was a tough task to cover a lot of ground and a lot of time in a very short period. I've got a little parting gift for you. Wellfield Botanic Gardens was actually founded by this club in 2005. Have you been before?
No, I have.
Have you heard of it?
I have heard of it.
That's good. Well, I know a guy there, and he can hook you up with a tour. But we got some passes for you. It's beautiful, and we'll take care of you. So thanks again for coming, and everyone, thanks so much for your attention, and just go out and enjoy the sunshine today. And thanks for those of you guests joining us today. It was a beautiful day. We'll see you again soon. Go out and make our community a better place. Rotary's adjourned.